The last of the villas fell below me as I climbed the final steps to the observation platform. Sitting on the castellated wall, I caught my breath in the cool air. Stretched out beneath me were the peninsular heights of Estrella de Mar. 10 miles to the east, the hotel towers of Fuengirola faced the sinking sun, their curtain walls like huge screens waiting for the evening's Son et Lumière performance. From the stone platform, the ground sloped down to the blackened grove of lemon trees and then to the rear gate and the garage apartment beside the fire-swept house. I left the platform and walked towards the orchard, searching the stony soil for any trace of the arsonist's footprints. Above my head sounded the leathery flutter of canvas. Curious to see who I was, the glider pilot hovered in the air above me, so close that his booted foot almost touched my head, his visor masking his eyes. Too distracted to wave to him, I stepped through the charred stumps of the lemon trees, my shoes crushing the flakes of charcoal that covered the ground. 30 yards away, the Hollinger's chauffeur stood by the gate, his back to the old Bentley in the drive. He watched me in the same fixed and half-threatening way, hands clasped across his chest. He stepped forward as I approached, his boots a few inches from a shallow pit excavated in the soil. A tag of yellow police tape flew from a wooden stump, and I assumed that it marked the hollow where the arsonist had hidden his incendiary flagons on the night before the fire. As if out of respect, the hang glider withdrew from the hill crest, its canvas cracking in the air. Miguel stood at the pit's edge, the calcinated soil crumbling under his feet. Despite his aggressive stance, he was waiting for me to speak to him. Had he conceivably caught even the briefest glimpse of the arsonist? "Miguel," I walked up to him, a hand raised in greeting. "I came to the house with Inspector Cabrera. I'm Frank Prentice's brother. I wanted to talk to you." He lowered his eyes and stared at the pit, then turned on his heel and walked back to the gate. He closed it behind him and moved quickly down the steps, shoulders hunched as he disappeared into the garage. "Miguel!" Irritated by the persistent hang glider, I looked down at my feet. 2 silver coins lay in the charcoal-covered soil, pieces of silver presumably intended to express the chauffeur's contempt for the family that had murdered his employers. I knelt down and prodded the coins with my fountain pen, then realized that I was touching a pair of car keys, linked together by a small metal chain and partly buried in the earth. Without thinking, I accepted that the keys were those of the Bentley, dropped by the chauffeur as he waited for me. I wiped them and brushed away the dirt, ready to return them to Miguel. But the Bentley's engine was turning, vapor rising from the exhaust, and the keys had no doubt been dropped by a member of the police forensic team. I held them in my hand, trying to identify the make of the car. But the flat chrome was unmarked. Already I suspected that the keys might belong to the arsonist, lost or forgotten by him when he retrieved the buried flasks. The hang glider hovered over my head, its steel guy ropes singing in the air. The pilot's gloved hands clasped the control bar as if reining in a winged horse. The craft banked steeply and dived across the orchard, its left wing nearly striking my face. I crouched among the burnt-out trees as the glider circled above me, ready to make another pass if I attempted to reach the gate to the Hollinger house. Head lowered, I ran across the ashy soil, deciding to make my way down the hillside that lay beyond the outer wall of the estate. Again, the glider soared forwards, riding the thermals that swept up the open slopes. The pilot seemed unaware that I was scrambling and sliding beneath him, his eyes apparently fixed on the waves rolling towards the beaches of Estrella de Mar. Below me appeared a line of villas built among the eucalyptus trees that lay beyond the lower boundary of the Hollinger estate. The rear gardens and courtyards were protected by high walls, and from the alarmed expression of a maid watching me from a second-floor balcony, I knew that none of the residents would come to my aid, let alone admit me to the shelter of their gardens. Covered with dust and ash, I stumbled towards the rear wall of the Protestant cemetery. The thoughtless pilot had returned to the summit, circling before he set off in a steep dive towards the landing beach below him. A stone refuse tip stood by the rear gate of the cemetery, filled with dead flowers and faded wreaths. I wiped my hands on a bouquet of cannas, trying to squeeze the last moisture onto my raw palms. Brushing the ash from my shirt, I pushed back the gate and set off through the graves. Apart from a single visitor, the burial ground was empty. A slim man in a gray suit stood with his back to me, clasping a spray of lilies and fern that he seemed reluctant to lay on the memorial stone. When I passed the burial plot, he turned and almost flinched from me, as if I had caught him at a moment of guilty thought. I recognized the mourner shunned by almost everyone at the funeral of B.B. Jansen. "Dr. Sanger, can I help you?" "No, thank you." Sanger was feeling the face of the headstone, his gentle fingers touching the letters incised in the polished marble. The silver stone was the same color as his hair and suit, and his eyes seemed even more melancholy than I remembered them. At last he laid the lilies against the stone and stood back, a hand on my elbow. "Well, how does that seem?" "It's a fine memorial," I assured him. I'm glad everyone rallied round." "I ordered it myself. It was the right thing to do." He offered me his handkerchief. "You've cut your hand. Shall I look at it for you?" "It's nothing. I'm in a hurry. A hang glider attacked me." "A hang glider?" He searched the sky and followed me when I set off for the entrance. I unlatched the gates and stepped into the street, steadying myself against the roof of a parked car. I tried to read the contours of the hillside. The Citroen was at least half a mile away, parked on the slopes to the east of the Hollinger estate. I waited for the next taxi to deliver mourners to the cemetery, then filled my lungs for the tiring walk. 50 yards from me, outside the entrance to the Catholic cemetery, a motorcyclist in black leathers and helmet sat astride his machine, a scarf over his face. His gauntleted hands gripped the handlebars, and I could hear the soft mutter of the machine's exhaust. The front wheel turned fractionally and seemed to point towards me. I hesitated before stepping from the curb. The road ran past the secluded villas and then dipped from sight as it descended towards Estrella de Mar. Hovering in the air like an observation craft was the hang glider, its wings placed between me and the setting sun, so that the fabric glowed like the plumage of a burning bird. "Mr. Prentice?" Dr. Sanger touched my arm. His face was composed now that he had left the cemetery. He pointed to a nearby car. "May I give you a lift? It might be safer for you." Criminals and benefactors. "You've been favored," I told Sanger as we rolled up the drive towards his villa. "Apart from New York, that's the most impressive collection of graffiti I've ever seen." "Let's be charitable and call it street art, but I'm afraid it has other intentions." Sanger stepped from his car and surveyed the garage doors. Graffiti covered every inch of the steel panels, an aerosol display of fluorescent whorls and loops, swastikas and threatening slogans that continued across the window shutters and front door. Repeated cleanings had blurred the pigments, and the triptych of garage, windows, and door resembled the self-accusing effort of a deranged expressionist painter. Sanger stared wanly at the display, shaking his head like the distracted curator of a gallery forced by the pressures of fashion to exhibit works for which he had little sympathy. "I suggest you rest for a few minutes," he told me as he unlocked the door. "The taxi can take you back to your car. It must have been an ordeal for you." "It's kind of you, Doctor. I'm not sure if I was in any danger. I seem to have a knack for tripping over my own feet." That hang glider sounded threatening enough. And the motorcyclist? Estrella de Mar is more dangerous than people think. Sanger ushered me into the hall, watching the empty street before closing the door. With a faint sigh, a mix of relief and resignation, he stared at the bare walls, crisscrossed by the shadows of the steel grills over the garden windows, each a dark portcullis. Our silhouettes moved across the bars, figures in a pageant of convict life. It reminds me of Piranesi's Carcery. I never thought I'd live inside those strange etchings. Sanger turned to examine me. "Were you in danger?" "Very possibly. Crawford likes to keep the pot stirred, but sometimes he goes too far." "I feel better than I thought. As it happens, that wasn't Crawford in the hang glider." Or on the motorcycle. His colleagues, I dare say. Crawford has a network of sympathizers who know what he wants. I assume they were teasing you. All the same, be careful not to expose yourself, even if you are Frank's brother. Sanger led me into a lounge overlooking a small walled garden almost entirely filled by a swimming pool. The long room was furnished with 2 armchairs and a low table. Books had once lined the walls, but now filled a collection of cardboard cartons. The air seemed motionless, as if the windows and doors to the garden were never opened. I can see you're moving, I commented. In or out? Out. I've found that this house had certain drawbacks as well as memories of a rather painful kind. Now sit down and try to calm yourself. Sanger steered me from the garden door, whose handle I was trying to turn, concerned for my overexcited state. His sensitive hands raised my chin, and I could smell the faint perfume of grave lilies on his fingertips. He touched the fading bruises on my neck and then sat in the leather chair facing me, as if ready to begin my analysis. Paula Hamilton told me about the attack in your brother's apartment. From what she said, the intruder decided not to kill you. Have you any idea why? You seem to have been completely at his mercy. I was. I think he wanted to see how I'd react. It was a kind of initiation, almost an invitation to the underworld? The real Estrella DeMar? Sanger frowned at me, disapproving of my lack of concern for myself. You've unsettled a great many people since you arrived, understandably so. All these questions, they had to be asked. Sanger's defensive manner irritated me. 5 people died in the Hollinger fire. An horrific crime, if it was deliberate. Sanger leaned forward, trying to smile away my brief show of testiness. These questions you've asked, they may not be the sort of questions that have answers in Estrella DeMar, or not the answers you'll want to hear. I stood up and paced along the empty bookshelves. There's not much chance of that. I've had no real answers at all. I'd like to think there was some kind of conspiracy going on, but there may not have been. All the same, I must free Frank from prison. Of course. His confession is so out of character. Inevitably, as the older brother, you hold yourself responsible. Do sit down and I'll bring you some mineral water. He excused himself, smoothing his silver hair in a mirror as he set off for the kitchen. I tried to visualize him living in this airless villa with the sedated Bibi Jansen, a curious menage even by the standards of Estrella DeMar. There was something almost feminine about Sanger, a constant attentiveness that might have reassured the dazed drug addict and persuaded her to invite him into her bed. I imagined him making love with all the unobtrusiveness of a ghost. At the same time, there was an evasive strain running through him that roused my suspicions. Sanger, too, had a motive for setting fire to the Hollinger house. The fetus in Bibi's womb. The discovery that he had made one of his patients pregnant would have led to him being struck from the medical register. Yet he had clearly cared for the young woman and had mourned her in his ambiguous way, braving the hostile crowd at the funeral, and then flushing with embarrassment when I caught him alone by the headstone. Vanity and self-reproach shared the same suede glove, and despite myself, I wondered if he had selected the exact shade of silver marble to match his suit and hair. I searched for a telephone, eager to call a taxi. The excitements of chasing Crawford around Estrella DeMar, the discovery of the keys, and my duel with the hang glider had left me ready for even more action. I walked to the garden windows and peered down at the drained pool. Someone had thrown a can of yellow paint over the wall, and a canary sunburst leaked towards the drainage vent. Another abstract painting, I remarked to Sanger when he returned with the mineral water. I can understand why you're moving. There's a time to stay and a time to leave, he shrugged, resigned to his own rationalizations. I own some property in the Costa Sol development along the coast, a few bungalows I let out in the summer. I've decided to take one of them for myself. A Residencia Costa Sol? It's very quiet. Of course, practically somnambulistic. But that's what I'm looking for. Security arrangements are more advanced than anywhere else on the coast. Sanger opened a window and listened to the evening sounds of Estrella DeMar, like an exiled political leader resigned to his heavily guarded villa in the company of his books. I won't say I've been driven out, but I'm looking forward to a quieter life. Will you practice there? Or are the people of the Pueblos beyond psychiatric help? That's a little unfair, Sanger waited for me to return to the armchair. No one would ever dare to retire if dozing in the sun was forbidden.